Okay, everybody, welcome to class. This is World Regional Geography. We're on week number 3. We are finishing the first quarter of class this week, which is really kind of cool. I can't teach while sitting down, so I'm going to have to stand up. What we're doing this week is working on chapter 3, which is North America, week number 3 right here. See where it is. It's further down. That's the one. Okay, so it is slide number something, I can't, 42, is the major agricultural and manufacturing activities of North America. So this map will lead into the economic and social development. It talks about patterns and abundance, not immigration. But the next couple pages, parts of the country and the economy. You can see here location factors, regions of economic activity. And if we zoom into this, too much, okay. We zoom into this, we could actually see parts of the country, parts of North America, Canada included, that are known for specific things, okay. So the question could be, using the map below, what are the spatial settings in North America economic activities? Indicate why specific activities are located where they are in the US and Canada. Okay, so let's talk about this general farming one, that pinkish one. That's in the Ohio River Valley, Western Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. General farming means usually smaller farms, anything from animal husbandry to corn and soybeans and wheat, not wheat really, corn and soybeans, small farms, vegetable gardens, things like that. Okay. And this generally tends to be a little more mountainous. It's a lot of water. It does rain. It's got the 4 seasons. So you have a good influence to have nice farms there, okay? The mixed farming zone, which we think of our breadbasket, the prairie states, from way western Ohio all the way through Iowa and South Dakota and Nebraska, Kansas. We're talking here soybeans, corn, cattle, sheep, chickens, these general farming and mixed farming. So you're talking about a lot of agribusiness, which is agriculture as a business. So the companies have like vertical integration. So they own the land, they own the seeds, they own the animals, and the farmers are sort of workers. And they produce, and it goes up the chain in the same company. Okay. Why would this orange section, livestock ranching, be so prominent in the West? Why is that different from the general farming, the dairy farming, and the mixed farming? Kayla, let's ask you first. So Kayla, this orange zone here, why is this really good for livestock ranching?
Give me 1 second. I'm so sorry. I'm like multitasking like no tomorrow right now.
Okay.
I have my niece over with me.
Oh boy.
Yeah, sadly. I'm sick and I have her. So you said, why is this good for livestock?
Yes, ma'am. Why is that orange zone good for livestock and ranching?
Well, we do get rain over there.
Mm-hmm.
But also the climate, like the temperatures and everything, I can say. So more of what's it called? Yeah, just kind of like the temperature. So it's good for the weather, or so you don't. I'm trying to like squint right now. But
can I make it bigger for you?
Yes, please. That would be helpful.
Now I just lost the page. What number? 47. That doesn't work. I zoomed in and I lost it. Okay, let's see. 52, 51, 47. There we go. Okay, so this orange section right here, all of it is west of the 100th parallel, which is this magic number. This parallel lines go pole to pole, like they're called meridians. And at the 100th parallel line, which is pretty much right through here, actually through the center of Texas, Austin, Oklahoma City, all the way up to Winnipeg. East of that line, you get a lot more rainfall.
Yeah.
And starting west of that line, you start getting drier and drier and drier. That's why you see a lot of the blue zones there. The blue is for irrigated agriculture. So you pull the water out of rivers or you pull it out of deep wells, like the Ogallala Aquifer and stuff like that. So why is the orange zone good for livestock and ranching?
Viola, can you go? Shoot. Hello, you go. Are we still on my question?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. No, like I was saying, like the soil productivity, I can say. I think that's the word. And the rain and all that we would get going. Like even though we have like the dry heat in like Phoenix and all that and Las Vegas, we still do get really good rain, so it would help for farming for the livestock and all that for food. As well as there's big areas of desert out there. So there's a lot of space.
Right. So when we're dealing with this territory, what do those bumps stand for? What are all these bumps and stuff?
Aren't those like mountains?
Those are mountains. So you can't really have a farm on the side of a mountain, right?
True.
Not too easily. I mean, it can be done, but not without a lot of intensive labor.
Yeah.
You also have dry climates, which doesn't help with farming corn or tomatoes or green peppers or stuff like that, like you would back east or in the Central Valley. So you're talking about environmental conditions, dry. The soils are a little drier and harder to grow from, and you don't have the water, and then you have the steep slopes. So all that leads to people saying, how are we going to take advantage of this land? How are we going to work off this land? And that comes in terms of livestock. Because livestock can graze the grasses. If you have access to water, either through a well or a creek, you can water those animals. And that's why the West, it's a large portion of the country, right? That's why this is really good for livestock. Good. And Kayla, you're off the hook now.
Cool. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
I'm multitasking.
So the irrigated sections, these blue zones here, these tend to be drier, and then you have the river basins. So even in Canada here, you do have some rivers up here, but you're also looking at deep wells. You know those windmills on farms? They're used to pull water up from the deep well below. And this area in blue by Oklahoma City and Kansas, that is the original Dust Bowl, or actually that was the Great American Desert, they called it, because it was so dry and there's not many surface creeks. So when they settled that area, it was during wet seasons and they were farming okay, but the 1930s rolled around and everything stopped raining, and that became really dry for almost 5 or 6 years in a row. And that's the Dust Bowl. And those folks moved to Southern California, going right through the Cajon Pass, down to the cities in Southern California. Okay, so that's good. Those blue zones are dry areas, but you need that water that you don't have in the West, but you do have in the East. That's why there's more agriculture dealing with irrigation here. Okay, The big brown section for most of California, Dominic, why is this needed here in California? Mediterranean agriculture, and then you have irrigation. Why do you need irrigation here in the Mediterranean climates? And this is for Dominic.
I'm sorry, what did you say? You said irrigation?
Yeah, the brown zone here in California, it says Mediterranean agriculture with irrigation. So we're talking about dry conditions, right?
Yeah. So what exactly?
In a Mediterranean climate, when does it usually when do we get rainfall? What parts of the year?
Like during like spring or like sometimes the summer.
Okay, so we live in a Mediterranean climate, right? For the most, we're very close to it. When do we get when is our wet season? What months of the year?
I think like April, March, like February.
Okay. Yeah, our wet season, supposedly the Mediterranean means wet winters and really dry summers. Right. When was the last time it rained here?
I think like in like February or January.
Yeah, I think it rained in March. Like up in the high desert, we got snow on Thanksgiving and then right before Christmas. We didn't get any more snow. We got some rain, usually in the winter time. Right, we get about 6¼ inches in Victorville of precipitation. So we get most of that water we get from the mountains running off. So in the winter time is when we supposedly have rain. That means for 9 months of the year, we got to pull water from the snowpack in Central California, in Southern California, or the dams from the rainfall that they collect in the wintertime in Northern California. So what do we grow in the Central Valley? And what do we grow in this part of California? What sort of foods?
I think like corn. I've seen like sunflowers.
Anyone else want to join Dom here and chime in? What else do we grow in California?
You can grow like probably some apricots, some probably like oranges.
Alfalfa, apple trees.
Yeah, so good. Do you know what one of the most intensive crops is in terms of water usage? And it doesn't seem like it would be, it's not like grapefruits or oranges. It's something completely different. Anyone know?
Is it almonds?
It's almonds.
It's almonds.
Yeah. The almonds and the cashews, those nuts, for some reason, they take a lot of water. And that's a big issue in California, dealing with who gets the water, whether it's agriculture, cities, or industry. And that's one of the big fights that we deal with. So because it's a dry climate and the LA basin, the San Diego basin should not have a population of 11 million people like it does. It should hold almost 750,000 to 500,000 people based upon the water that it does get. But we bring water from all parts of California and the Colorado River into Southern California to quench the thirst of the 11 million people we have. And the same thing in the Silicon Valley in San Francisco, they get their water from Hetch Hetchy and the Sierra Nevadas. So this farming, this agriculture is different than what we see out east because of the water issues and the types of rainfall and when we get it. Okay. Now let's look at the manufacturing zones, these hatched manufacturing regions. Okay. Why is LA and San Diego, why is Southern California and the Bay Area so vital for manufacturing and stuff like that? Go ahead, Legacy. You're up.
Is it because the population is larger?
Well, we have large populations, but so does Dallas and Fort Worth and Austin and Baltimore and DC. They have large populations, right? But why is it industry, manufacturing? We can't farm, that's true, right? Because we have too many people. But notice where a lot of these manufacturing places are.
Oh, they're right up on the sea.
They're right up on the sea or the oceans or water bodies like the Great Lakes. The only exceptions are the I-85 boom belt in the Carolinas and I-20 between Atlanta and Birmingham. Okay, these are zones that have a lot of coal nearby, especially Birmingham. It has large cities, textile, so it had a lot of water power to produce a lot of that manufacturing. Along the coasts, we do have water power. We have also markets and access to the rest of the world, right? That helps tremendously. Okay, and then you get the Gulf Coast here. The Gulf Coast is anything from agricultural products to oil and gas and energy reserves, and then fishing and stuff like that. Again, you need to be close to the coast in order to export that to the rest of the world. Okay. The yellow zone here is dairy farming, and that's like cows. And, you know, Wisconsin's famous for cows and cheese, and the cheese heads that follow the packers. But these tend to be smaller farms closer to the big cities because dairy products can't sit in trucks for very long without being refrigerated. So they have to be sort of close to the cities. And that's why the dairy farming was there. Commercial wheat and small grain farming, that's the drier climates and colder climates. And then the specialty crops and livestock, that's the southeast where you have a lot of rainfall and a lot of water. Okay. So these areas, service and industrial, that deal with population and also the environment and climate. It's a big deal. Okay. So does that help you with anything, Oslin? You doing okay?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
You know how the orange, like the livestock ranching, is dry and everything like that? Why don't like people just move, like for the convenience, you know?
Yep.
Like
Well, they do. People do leave there a lot. Like, here we go. Here's a question for you. Here, like, we're from Victorville in the high desert, Apple Valley and Adelanto and Oak Hills, right? Hesperia. So when you're 22, 21, is there a lot to do for us here as young adults?
No.
Not a lot of jobs. It's not very exciting. So why do people leave Victorville and high desert and go to San Diego and Los Angeles?
It's better climate change and more jobs.
More jobs, right? More younger people that are like them. Okay. And a lot of these farming zones, like Iowa and the Dakotas, they're getting older and older as the young people don't want to be around there anymore. So the young people will leave. Some people are leaving because of climate change and it's getting too dry. They can't make money anymore. But these cities, Vegas, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and Albuquerque and Denver, these are booming cities. These are they are drawing people in from all over the place because they are leaving those rural zones. That's a great question, Oslin. People are leaving these rural zones because of many reasons: climate change, boring, no jobs, job opportunities are really low, and they're going to the big cities where it's exciting, where there's a lot of possibilities of jobs. And there's also people their age they can interact with, hook up with, and marry, right? That's a big deal. And that's a great question. Okay. So yes, people do leave these areas, especially when it gets too dry or gets too hard, or the Rio Grande Valley in Albuquerque all the way up to Colorado. People are having a lot of trouble because the water has to go to more and more people and more population, and the water's running out. So that's a great question. My next door neighbor's from Yuma, Arizona, which is right down here. And, you know, if you look at an age sex diagram of Yuma, Arizona, there's not many people under 45. And most of the people are over 65, right? So as a young person, she couldn't wait to get out of there. She's like, I can't wait to leave Yuma. And I left as soon as I turned 21, went to college, and never came back, right? Except to see mom and dad. But that's part of the issue. That's exactly what you're talking about, Austin. People don't want to stay in places that are boring and no jobs. Yeah, great question. Great point.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Darren.
So where do we get?
Austin, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry, Darren, go ahead.
It's okay. Where do we get our milk from? Since you mentioned that that milk cannot be transported for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we get the store-bought milk from?
Okay, so we get our milk from the valleys in the Great Valley, the San Joaquin Valley, but we also get them from farms all over the place too. But it's all due to irrigation.
Oh, okay.
Because this is wetter here, you don't need that irrigation. The irrigation, the Mediterranean agriculture, that is a lot of mixed agriculture. Anything from strawberries to avocados to pecans and what was the nut? Almonds,
Mm-hmm.
to alfalfa and cotton. I mean, California is #1 in so many different types of agriculture because of the water we bring in, and it's sunny, especially the Central Valley. It's sunny for much of the year. And you could have 2 growing seasons because of the climate's so great. But the issue is the water. So yeah, to go back to the livestock stuff, I mean, there are cows all over the country that give milk, and there's chickens and eggs and poultry and stuff like that all over the country. But it dominates the Northeast and the East because of the water and the big cities. But we do have cows all over the place. Especially San Luis Obispo, Paso Robles area. It's wine and cows and farming there.
Okay.
Good question, Darren. So if you want, you could go look up, you know, where does your milk come from? Okay. The milk will come locally for the most part. Butter and cheese, they're probably imported. And now that we have trains that have coolers, what are they, refrigerated trains and refrigerated trucks, it's a lot easier to bring stuff from other parts of the country. That's a big deal. Okay, other ones here. What do these red dot cities mean? Anyone see that there? What does it say?
Those are the major cities, right?
The major cities with key global links. Okay, links to the outside world. So when I say San Francisco, what do you think about linking to the outside world? What industries are based in San Francisco that have links to the rest of the world? Matthews, let's ask you, Matthews. San Francisco.
Is it a college?
Well, you have Berkeley and you have Stanford. Okay, that's pretty good. San Jose State's not bad.
And tourism?
Tourism, but the links, key global links. Okay, this goes back to the history of California. San Francisco became the biggest city on the West Coast for a long time because of what was found in the mountains here. What was found in the mountains in the 1840s and 1850s? Their football team is named after them. Sorry, their American football team is named after them. Anyone want to help Matthews? Austin, Lacey? What's San Francisco's American football team name? The one with the red and the gold?
The 49ers.
The 49ers. And what do the 49ers signify? Like, why is it not the 89ers or the 42ers or anything like that?
Maybe that was the year they were founded.
No.
It was because they were trying to take advantage of the gold rush at that time.
Okay, the gold rush happened in 1849 and 1850 and 1851, right? So the gold that was found in the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas in 1849 was brought down to San Francisco, and you became a banking center. Okay, you could write that down somewhere. San Francisco is known for its banking. It's the home of Bank of Italy, which has now become the Bank of America. You know, and well, what's the one with the stagecoach? What's that bank called? Anybody? What's the bank with the stagecoach from San Francisco? They're all in the old movies, the Wells Fargo. And ever heard of Wells Fargo?
Yeah.
Okay, that bank and the Bank of California, Bank of Italy, then the Bank of America were founded both in San Francisco due to the gold rush. So this has become the financial center for the whole West Coast. And it's got a great harbor, so it is a big shipping zone for the rest of the country as well. Okay, Los Angeles, why is that considered a key city with global links? What's famous about Los Angeles?
Hollywood.
Mm-hmm. You have Hollywood and the entertainment industry, which is really, really key. It's not the biggest in the world, and it doesn't make the most money, but it's huge in much of the, everyone knows what Hollywood is in Los Angeles. Even if you're in India or Ghana or Australia or China, you've heard of Hollywood before and their movies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Vegas, what is Vegas linked to the rest of the world with?
Casinos.
Casinos, gambling, entertainment, right? Los Angeles is also high tech and aerospace. Okay, all around LAX, they have all those aerospace places. You have Edwards Air Force Base nearby. You have the logistics airport in Adelanto or Victorville that's tied to aerospace. Palmdale, my brother from DC, he flies out to LA maybe every couple months, and they take him on a private plane up to Palmdale to see all those military planes because he's a patent lawyer or something like that. But that's a big deal, and it brings in a lot of money and jobs to the LA and San Diego areas. Okay, what's Houston known for? Anybody?
I don't know.
Okay, Houston's home for actually a lot of refugees from Vietnam, since the climate is very similar to Vietnam, but it's the big hub for oil and gas. It's the oil and gas headquarters of the coast. Okay, there are refineries all up and down this coastline, and Houston is the home of that energy conglomerate. Atlanta is famous for the CNN and Coca-Cola. It held the Olympics in 1996. It is the big financial center of the South, although Charlotte is challenging that tremendously with the big banks they have there. Okay, New York, Toronto, Montreal, Chicago, Seattle, Vancouver especially. These are big world cities with a lot of population from other places around the world. So whether it's finance for New York or advertising or finance in Toronto and Chicago's meatpacking and trade, financial stuff. These are big cities that have links to the rest of the world, which is kind of cool. Okay, so that answers the question, why are specific activities located in certain zones? Okay, questions at all with that? Okay, the next essay, let's see, geopolitics. I'm trying to find population here. We'll deal with population, that's immigration, cities. There we go. All right. So here's the population of North America. And notice Mexico is not included in this North America. Anyone want to talk about why? Why is Mexico not in this chapter? Okay. Where do you think, which part of the world do you think Mexico would be included in if it's not in North America?
South America.
South America, they call that Latin America, right? Latin America starts pretty much Los Angeles, Phoenix, El Paso, and San Antonio to the south, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. But because Mexico has a different history, it was settled by Spanish more than Western Europeans, like the East Coast here, but we have a lot of Spanish and Hispanic populations everywhere from Houston, Dallas, all the way to San Francisco. Okay, we have Latin American folks in Miami and the Carolinas a lot, and then New York City. But in general, the history of Mexico, the culture of Mexico, the language of Mexico sort of separates it from, they call it Anglo-America, even though that's a terrible term these days. The maybe British North America, right? Canada and the United States, France was in there too. So a lot of people don't realize that two of the oldest locations, the oldest founding settlements in North America are both Spanish or Mexican. Okay, Jacksonville has, right outside Jacksonville is St. Augustine, the longest occupied city in North America. And then the Santa Fe area near Albuquerque was settled way before the 13 colonies came about, and almost the same time period as the Jamestown and whatever is that called, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this part of the country is completely different historically than this part of the country. And that's why Mexico is sort of not considered part of this section of North America, mainly because of culture and history. Okay, so this question dealing with the population of America and the American West and the Canadian West. So we're talking about the United States and Canada. And you can see, remember that 100th parallel? Remember we talked about that earlier? Look at the difference, the population difference. Okay, again, what's to the west here? It's dry. And to the east is wet, and you could definitely see that with population. Can you see that stark difference, everybody?
Yeah.
It's a huge difference. And that follows the rainfall amount. I think it's 20 inches. 20 inches is the modifier there. Okay, so in the United States and Canada, we see the increasing population of the West cities, the cities in the West. And here you go, growth in the interior West. From Edmonton down to Phoenix, many interior cities in North America West have witnessed some of the continent's most rapid growth in the last 50 to 60 years. Okay, we have a lot of natural resources which help, the amenities, especially along the coast, the climate, the dry climates, the wet climates in the Northwest. These are attracting people from all over the world, not just the East Coast, but all over the world. Okay, so I would like you to list, because the essay question is going to ask you to write this out. So before you go into your test, I want you to have a list of things that that identify why people are moving out west. Okay. Please include major pull factors. So why are people moving to Las Vegas or Los Angeles or Sacramento is a huge city? Why do people move these places?
There's more jobs and more people their age.
Okay. That's one, but it's not a huge pull factor from the rest of the world, right? If you're from Beijing, why are you coming to San Francisco or Los Angeles? If you're from the Philippines, why are you moving to Los Angeles and not to Minneapolis or Pittsburgh?
There's more places they can go to learn and study and understand the new culture.
Okay.
Why would they want to go to California anyway if it's the most expensive state?
Well, it's expensive because there's a lot of people here, right?
Yeah.
And it must be drawing people for some reason. Okay. So how many of y'all are born and raised in California?
Me.
That's one,
I am.
2, 3, 4.
Me.
Okay. Do you know anyone that's moved to California from other places,
Yeah.
whether it's in the United States or outside of the United States? Why did they move here?
They want a better opportunity.
Better opportunities, because there's possibilities of jobs here. The economy is the 5th biggest in the whole world, right? There's a lot of jobs. What's the difference between the Northeast here, Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, Boston, and Los Angeles and San Francisco? What's one big difference? Why would people leave Buffalo to come to Los Angeles? Okay, bye. Okay. What are the winters like in Buffalo or Chicago?
Cold as hell.
Cold as hail. I heard that hail. Sorry, Lacey's got kids around, so. And Kayla, and you're the one with the little cousin nearby, Kayla.
Yeah, she's currently taking a nap at the edge of my bed.
Oh, good. All right, so it's cold as anything. And what else do they get in Buffalo that we don't get in Los
Snow.
Angeles?
A lot of snow.
A lot of snow. Okay. The jobs have left. They call this the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is where these old factories are rusting away and they're trying to redevelop their economies. A lot of people moved to the South, where it's warmer environments and warmer climates, but also a lot of people moved out West, where you could start again, where you have much better climates, not the humidity that you see in the Southeast. more favorable towards unions and higher pay in the West than you do have in the Southeast. That helped. The new industries, whether it's aerospace or agriculture or technology firms or coffee and Amazon and all that stuff up in the Pacific Northwest, these are reasons for people to come here. Okay. People from New York move to California, and it's even less taxes here than some cities in the Northeast. Now that's changed a little bit because we have so many people and so many problems. We need to fund that, but that's one issue. Okay. Other reasons for leaving, maybe it's cleaner air, not LA, but throughout the West, usually cleaner. That's changing. Denver is pretty polluted because of the air problems. Salt Lake City's in sort of a basin, but generally you have cleaner air. You have better what's it called, regulations on pollution. So that helps a little bit. Okay. So when people move here, and we're talking anywhere from Edmonton to Denver to Phoenix, what changes in the culture of this new city when you have influxes of people all over the world coming? What do people bring with them when they move to a new location?
New food or items.
Mm-hmm. They bring everything, right? Food, religion, values, music, clothes, right? All sorts of things are brought to here from the rest of the world, the rest of the planet. And that's changing. That's becoming a melting pot. Now that's good and bad, right? It's good for diversity. It's good for economic opportunity and creativity. But it's also bad for those who don't want change, the conservatives among us who don't want change, who don't want things changing at all. Bringing other ideas from the rest of the world is different and stressful to them or to us. Okay. Let's see. Now, what are the problems that we see with this big influx of people? How much is an apartment to rent?
$750.
And $750 for one bedroom, maybe, right?
Mm.
Maybe if we're lucky. Okay, if you're in the LA County area, yes, very much. That's way cheap. But in Victorville, $750 seems a lot.
Like 1,000.
Yeah, $1,000, and that's a lot of money. So you have high rents, high cost of living, driven a population of homeless residents. We have homeless residents all throughout the West. Okay. Migration from either legal or illegal migration to the West because of the job opportunities and the companies that really don't care where their employees come from. And they're the ones that don't get in trouble for some reason. And you see that backlash, the native born fighting against change in immigration. Okay. So you have a lot of differences, a lot of changes quickly really put a stress on some cultures and cultural norms and mores. But a lot of people are moving, and it's not just the United States. People are moving to Vancouver and Calgary, Edmonton for energy jobs. Okay, people are moving out west because of the crowded conditions in the east or job opportunities that they would not have in Mexico City or great climates that they do not have in Australia or Bangladesh, right? They're moving to the Western cities. Okay. Does that help at all? Does that help sort of give you an idea of what's going on here?
Yeah.
Okay. And you can see something called a megalopolis, which is a large city, a huge city. This looks like it's San Francisco. No, that's Chicago. That's Chicago. And you can see here the European settlement. And again, you can see the upper Rio Grande Valley. That was Spanish settlements. Okay, the French settlements in the north. And everyone here, 1750s, that's the gold rush. So you had people from all over the planet coming to the San Francisco area. Chinese, Japanese, Italians, Poles, French, Basque folks, people from Spain and France, Russians, I've said Chinese already, Indonesians. You had many, many people coming from the rest of the world here because of the opportunities for riches and stuff like that. Okay. So this ties in with the interregional population flows, persistent westward movement, African Americans leaving the rural South because of nasty remnants of civil rights movement, and we're seeing that again in the last 4 years, 5 years of bigotry and non-inclusion of people. Okay, so people don't want to, for a long time, people, especially African Americans, left the South to go to the North where there were factory jobs, where they didn't have to deal with lynchings and the KKK. After the civil rights of the 60s and 70s, African Americans and whites started moving to the South because of that lack of the KKK and Jim Crow laws, but we're seeing that it's still under the surface there. And not just there, but all over the country. So people also were moving from the Northeast and the Southeast to the West because of that opportunity, because of those push factors from the Southeast. Okay. We're also seeing a lot more rural to urban. So people are leaving, as Oslin was saying earlier, leaving the countryside where there's not much going on, not many young kids, and they're going to the urban areas because of economic opportunity. That's the big key, economic opportunity, i.e. jobs. Okay. And then we're also seeing from the 60s onward, we're seeing people leave downtown zones and going to the suburban areas. They call these edge cities, cities around the edge of the big metropolitan zone, like Victorville. Victorville is not the center city of Los Angeles. It's way out there, but it's on the outskirts of the LA metro zone. Just like San Bernardino used to be, just like Riverside used to be. Fontana is now almost as big as San Bernardino. It's going to be the largest city in the county, probably at this next census mark this year. If not then probably mid-2020s. So you're seeing these people leaving, not these people, everybody leaving the inner city zones if they can, going to these suburban zones. Okay, and then that leads to demographic change, that leads to political change, as we're seeing a lot of states turning purple, you know, red to blue or blue to red, because of the changing shifts of our populations. Okay. So any questions at all? Anything I could help you with? I think those are the three big essays I wanted to cover. Okay. So that American Canadian West question, and then the North American economic activity question, that's from this chapter. That's the essay sections. Okay.